Secondary inhumation is defined as the burial or manipulation of disarticulated human remains. In its initial formulation, secondary burial practices were put in contrast to primary inhumations, which was the original location of defleshing. Now, secondary inhumations as a term has come to define a much wider range of social practices. In this video, we're going to explore three key aspects to secondary inhumations. The first being that the process of breaking down a body and transforming a body from fully articulated to disarticulated has significant social and broader theoretical consequences that we're going to explore. The second piece is that the addition of extra steps to the mortuary practices creates more locations for archaeologists to explore and to understand the social significance of mortuary practices. And third and finally, the secondary practices also involve a much longer duration of engagement with the body. In this video, we're going to start by exploring the process of transforming a body from articulated to disarticulated before we start to get into some of the spatial, temporal, and interpretive consequences of these changes. Secondary inhumation requires disarticulated remains. As a result, one of the most important steps in this process is to ask, what was the process by which a fully articulated body was transformed into a disarticulated skeleton? Now, there are three main ways in which defleshing occurs in the mortuary tradition. We're going to unpack each of these in turn, the first being excarnation, the second being interring of a body, and the third being deliberate human intervention in the process. We're going to focus on the taphonomy of the processes and how we can identify the differences in the archaeological record. Some cultures use excarnation to deflesh human remains. Excarnation is when a body is left exposed to the elements. In this context, the weather and also animals can come in and speed up the process of defleshing. Archaeologically, we might expect to see some changes to the bones because of this. We might see some weathering on the surfaces of the bones. We might also expect to see maybe some teeth marks from animal gnawing. We might also be missing some bones as a body may be jostled around due to some of the animal activity. This process often includes the creation of a space where bodies are laid out and then later on collected fully for interment somewhere else. Another way in which bodies become defleshed is through the process of internment. Now, this is the more traditional form of secondary inhumation, where you have a primary burial that is then returned to, excavated out, the bones are collected, and then reburied somewhere else. This also includes a interment in a structure. And we refer to these structures as charnel houses. Within the charnel house, bodies are laid out and are allowed to decompose. They're not fully exposed to the elements, but they are able to be decomposed within this process. And finally, the disarticulated remains are collected and interred somewhere else as a secondary rite. Now, archaeologically, we'd expect the bones in these processes to not have as much weathering as we would from excarnation. We would potentially expect to see some of the smaller bones missing as well, as people didn't collect and pick out all of the different small pieces from an originally buried grave. The other main way in which bodies become defleshed is through a process of intentional defleshing by humans. Now, this usually involves some sort of cutting implement to cut up pieces of the body. Now, sometimes this can occur at the time of death, but this may also occur well after death as the body decomposes variably. So while most of the soft tissue may be gone, there may still be some ligaments that are holding together key joints that require a cutting implement to pull apart to separate some of those bones. Now in the archaeological record, we expect to see cut marks on the bones associated with the intentional cutting of those remains by people. Now these processes of defleshing a body really transform the body and divide it up into smaller pieces. Now there may be functional reasons for this, such as that it's easier to transport a body that has been disarticulated, but there also may be bigger social implications for this, as now the body is not just interacted with at the time of death and the time of burial, but in many different ways, in many different kinds of contexts. We're going to shift now to the spatial and temporal dimensions of secondary inhumations before we return to think about the broader consequences of these types of treatments. From a spatial perspective, secondary inhumations increase the number of places on a landscape that people engage with human remains. We may have the place of initial defleshing, which may still be a grave, but it may also be a charnel house or some other excarnation tower, for example. Those initial burial locations are supplemented by the locations where those bones are moved to, these places of secondary interment. These may also be graves, but they may be installations within ritual structures or other contexts where elements of a skeleton are deployed. Now, this diversity of spatial locations offers a lot of opportunities for archaeologists to trace and to track how bodies move from the original state of life and death into all the different ways in which a body can be used and the body parts can be used. Once a body has been skeletonized, those bones are more durable and are able to be transported and used for a much longer period of time than the complete corpse. In this way, the process of transforming a body into a skeleton, to disarticulating it, creates a new substance. It creates a new type of material culture that people can engage with. This means that people are engaging with this in the process of defleshing, which occurs over a longer period of time. But it also means that people may return to old graves or may curate human remains for centuries before they ultimately bury them in the ground. In this way, the active manipulation of human remains can extend well after the lifespan of that. Secondary inhumations provide different lines of evidence for archaeologists who are studying mortuary practices than primary inhumations do. A primary inhumation, when the individual was buried close to the time of death, there's probably a very strong connection between the individual and the people doing the burying. In some cases, in secondary inhumations, the skeletal remains can be in circulation for decades, if not centuries, before it's finally interred. In these cases, the individual identity of the person's bones is less important than what their bones come to represent in terms of ancestry. In the PPNA, in the early Neolithic in the Near East, there's a tradition of skull removal from graves. So the burial will be placed in the ground. A stone or other form of kind of ochre marking will be placed over the floor in the house where the burial was placed. And the stone and the colored marker would indicate the position of the skull. People would then come back after a period of time, after the body has been defleshed, excavate out that skull, and then use that skull in a series of ritual actions. Now, in some cases, such as in Jericho, they have gone another step and remade a face for those skulls. These are referred to as plastered skulls, where they use clay to reform a face around that skull. Now these plastered skulls are then used and deployed and curated for a very long period of time to be able to, for those communities to include them in their ritual processions. In this way, we see that the process of creating and transforming a body from an individual to a skull changes what that individual's bones could be. They are then able to be, the individual identity may be erased, but it's replaced with a potentially a memory of an ancestor identity in that kind of a context. We also see secondary remains being important as objects of power. At the Mitla Fortress site in Oaxaca, a classic period site in the highlands of southern Mexico, there's evidence for a primary inhumation where a missing femur, with a missing femur. Now there is a tradition in the iconography of the region of individuals carrying femurs with them. And so perhaps this individual who has a missing femur, after they were buried, someone came back in, excavated out that femur, and used that femur as a symbol of power and authority. Now archaeologically, we don't have that femur, so we only have the body with the missing femur. This would be a location of primary inhumation that indicates secondary manipulation of the skeleton. This is often what we're finding. Sometimes we'll find the context where the bundled burials are placed, and sometimes we will find the locations from which they were excavated and moved. They'll have different types of signatures archaeologically, and we can explore what those are throughout our rest of our class here. Secondary inhumations add a new level of complexity to the mortuary traditions. With this, it gives archaeologists an opportunity to explore a really wide range of questions about differences in the concept of the body, issues of social memory and ancestry, but also things like power and authority within a particular social context. The body becomes a very powerful substance, and through the continued manipulation of bones that's involved in a secondary mortuary practice, we see a much more active role of the dead in the lives of the living.